Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we're trading your buzzing tracking app for something older and oddly calmer. A caravan's bell, a lantern's halo, a kettle that remembers when to sigh. Why is Silk Road a modern label? What did a tracking number look like 2,000 years ago? This is our journey along the Silk Road, where packages had knees, receipts were clay seals, and camels thought paper was a snack. If this cosy story helps you drift off, please subscribe, tap like, and leave a gentle comment. Your support keeps the journey continues. You check a tracking number tonight, and a little bar inches from processed to out for delivery. It reassures you with its digital hum, a promise wrapped in pixels. On the old routes we're about to walk, your tracking number had knees and opinions. It smelled faintly of leather and tea, it jingled at the camel's chest, and it stopped for weather whether you approved or not. Still, there is a deep bedtime comfort in that older rhythm: hoof, bell, breath, a kettle that remembers how to be helpful, a lantern that knows exactly how much light a room needs when the day is done. The Silk Road, to begin gently and accurately, is a modern name for a very old habit. It was never a single road with a ribbon cutting, nor only about silk. It was a family of land routes and sea lanes, choosing and re-choosing themselves according to season, politics, and the mood of a mountain pass. Imagine a web slung between oases, ports, and high saddles of stone, threads twitching when a market laughed, when a dynasty cleared a road, when a monastery rebuilt its kitchen, when a storm asked everyone to sit. People passed along it with bales and gossip, letters and recipes, coins and promises. Goods moved, yes, but so did ways of doing things. How to stitch a strap that won't sulk, how to seal a jar against dust with wax that behaves, how to weigh out saffron without letting the fragrance do all the persuading. Start, as the name invites us, with silk. Though silk itself began not in palaces but in courtyards, on trays of mulberry leaves, in the practiced hands of women whose attention taught patience to thread. Leaves were clipped and carried, silkworms chewed with a fuss that sounded like rain rehearsing, cocoons were boiled, filaments teased into continuity until they crossed and recrossed on a loom with a softness that behaves like strength. By the first millennium BCE, silk had already learned to travel beyond its birthplace, not as a single grand export, but as dowry and tribute, as temple gift and soldier's pay, as the kind of cloth that makes even a practical person touch their sleeve twice. The East kept the craft close. The West admired the shine and invented metaphors to forgive its ignorance. Like water, but obedient, someone surely said, adjusting a cuff. Silk became not just a fabric, but a sentence. Courts sent it as diplomacy, officials recorded it as pay, merchants treated it as currency. Smooth, quiet coin measured by the bolt. But silk never travelled alone. Alongside it came wool that shrugged off wind, hemp that could be persuaded into honesty, tea compressed into cakes of excellent common sense, glass with bubbles like small cheerful planets, dyes that taught cloth to keep a promise. A caravan was a moving pantry and a moving library. It rattled with hardware and rustled with paper. The name Silk Road is neat. The reality was happily untidy. The land taught to travellers the alphabet they needed. To the northeast, the Tian Shan kept their high blue grammar. To the west, the Pamirs rearranged punctuation into commas and colons of pass and valley. Between them lay the Taklamakan, a desert so wide and firm of character that no one argued about crossing its belly. Everyone skirted its rim, hopping from oasis to oasis, like someone with scent stepping stones across a stream. Dunhuang stood near the eastern door, where caves carved into the soft cliff would one day shelter paintings and scrolls that survived, because dry air was a strict but excellent archivist. Khotan, down along the southern arc, owned jade in its rivers and a gift for borrowing ideas and then making them local. Kashgar watched the western gate with the friendliness of an innkeeper who also keeps a ledger. Turfan held water in grape-fed courtyards whose shade could calm a cranky afternoon. Empires tried to make the road their own, and, at their best, learned to make it comfortable instead. In the 2nd century BCE, the Han court in China sent an envoy named Zhang Qian toward the northwest to look for allies against the steppe powers. He was captured and escaped and kept going, an almost comic persistence if you ignore the maps. He returned with news of horses that seemed to run on springs, of cities that managed their markets with wit, of grapes and alfalfa, and people who spoke languages that sparkled differently on the tongue. Alliances were complicated, information was magnificent. The Han state thereafter spoke of the Western regions, as if it had found the world's coat closet and intended to keep it tidy. Garrisons sprouted beside markets. Markets brought tolls, and tolls brought receipts that behaved like charms against confusion. The trick was always the same: make the path predictable, and travellers will build their own luck upon it. If the Han organised one rim of the web, others kept the middle stretch taut. The Parthians, then the Sasanians, held the Iranian plateau and the paths between Mesopotamia and the high routes of Central Asia like experienced innkeepers, firm on price, generous with water, discreet with rumour. To the south and east, the Kushan realm, a hinge between the Indo-Gangetic world and the passes toward Bactria, made coins in many scripts, and kept corridors open with a mixture of piety, pride, and practical architecture. Sogdian communities, centred around Samarkand, Bukhara, and towns that knew every polite way to say perhaps tomorrow, became the interpreters of the middle. Their letters, a few of which survive like receipts rescued from a drawer, describe prices, delays, weather, and cousins. They prove what you already suspect: commerce is a form of conversation, and the most valuable cargo is a good introduction. Let the day begin in a caravan yard near Dunhuang. Coals under ash remember enough to become a fire with very little encouragement. A kettle mutters its intentions. In the half-light, the caravan master walks the line of animals and touches each muzzle, taking a reading in breath and temperament. Felt pads go on first, patient cushions between weight and bone, then pack saddles that look at this hour like furniture for a house you haven't built yet. Bales arrive from a storeroom where, yesterday, someone whispered to a scale pan and it answered with honest numbers. Knots are tied the way an old song is sung, without fuss, exactly right, pleasantly resistant to being improved. A bright rag on the lead rope identifies your train in a crowded yard, our ancestor to the colour-coded luggage strap. A camel eyes the account book with the expression of a scholar who suspects footnotes are edible. Each animal on the road has its opinion and its gift. Bactrian camels, two-humped citizens of the cold desert, carry themselves with the modest certainty of librarians who have seen everything and will not be impressed this year either. Mules calculate footing, horses argue for speed, yaks disdain drama and convert altitude into calm. A good leader arranges the loads like a dinner seating. No two quarrelsome personalities together. Fragile jars cushioned by cloth that doesn't mind being leaned upon. Equal weight on each side so that backs don't write complaint letters by noon. A day's pace is the wisdom of a body. Start while morning is still polite. Pause when heat wants to put arguments into everyone's mouth. Move again as shadow returns to the world and the stones stop believing they are stoves. Navigation begins with landmarks and ends with memory. Cairns mutter direction. A wind notch in a ridge sings the note that means turn soon. An old tamarisk marks a bend where the sand squeaks underfoot the way a soapmaker's floorboards do. At night, stars hold up their end of the bargain. Someone in this company knows them not simply as coordinates, but as personalities. The belt that always tucks its shirt, the curl that arrives late and makes up for it with enthusiasm. You walk towards stories until they set, then you sleep and adopt new stories in the east. Sounds vague until you see how accurately a well-told story can steer a person who's listening. No coin ruled the entire route. In one city, copper cash clacked together like bingo tokens. In another, silver spread itself into thin discs. In a third, gold appeared like a polite elder who occurs seldom and makes decisions rather than arguments. Scales mattered more than faces, and a weight that behaved the same in two markets felt like civilization. Exchange was ceremony. A money changer's touchstone, dabbed with a streak from a coin and read with a squint, turned uncertainty into the daily miracle of agreement. Discounts existed, but under other names. Respect, repetition, the kind of reputation that lets a person take credit and bring it back without sweating through their shirt. Paper was the most persuasive traveller of all. Contracts took form as ink on silk or paper, as careful writing on wooden slips bound with cord, or as tallies. Two notch sticks married and then split so that reunion proved both halves' honesty. Seals pinched clay or led onto cords. Signets pressed faces into wax that cooled like approval. A letter of introduction could carry more weight than a purse, and required less maintenance. Later, when letters of payment moved value without the anxiety of metal, their lightness felt like intelligence. A document folded into a sleeve is a warm, reassuring thing. It is also, when you hold it close, the sound of a gate deciding to open. At day's end, the caravanserai waits, a square of order set against disorder, in the same way a calm hand steadies a skittish horse. From a distance, the gate is what you see, a tall rectangle that is not quite austere because it has learned the art of welcome. Inside lies the courtyard, a well in the middle with a lid to keep out dust and mischief, arcades in shade, doors that thud with a note you can trust. The stables are cool and airy. Mangers have been carved with the foresight that bored animals will nibble wood if not kept entertained. There is a bakery where flatbread clings to the wall of the oven and then falls away with perfect obedience, a bathhouse where steam applauds tired muscles, a small infirmary that smells of oil and linen, and a little vinegar which has for centuries been an enthusiastic multitasker. In many inns, a prayer room waits, not bossy about theology, content to set a direction or offer a niche where a lamp behaves. Endowments often pay for such places, a signature on a deed buying shelter not only for the named donor's soul, but for 1,000 unnamed bodies. Hospitality becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure smiles and pours tea. The staff know their choreography. A gatekeeper who can weigh a person and a caravan with the same calm glance. A stableman who can tell whether a saddle sore is mechanical or emotional. A clerk whose neatness makes you decide to be honest because it seems a shame to smudge such organised paper. A money changer carries his weights in a velvet-lined case with the gravity of a minor priest. Food repairs patience. A pot of chickpeas persuades onions to be generous. A few shreds of dried meat agree to become tender. Raisins insist on sweetening the mood. Flatbread stamps the table with a pattern that doubles as bakery pride and theft prevention. Tea arrives like good news. In some regions, fermented mare's milk lifts an eyebrow at restraint. Sensibly, tomorrow's stories improve under its influence. Bargains begin again, softer now, as if everyone remembers that arrival in daylight is a roof-mate at night. The guard on the roof yawns with the impartiality of a philosopher. Stars repeat themselves in ways that make sleep feel like part of the plan. Craft made the road possible. The road repaid the favour with customers. Somewhere down an alley, the dyers are arguing kindly over mordants. The air smells like vinegar and ambition. In a courtyard, the weaver flicks her wrist so that the weft behaves. The threads make a quiet music. A smith taps iron into nails with the long patience of someone who understands that consistency is the speed that matters. A carpenter eyes a crate that has decided to become a parallelogram and scolds it back into its senses. Repair is the second religion of any long day. Straps stretched and stitched, skins patched with warm pitch, a hinge persuaded into civility by a drop of oil. Perfection would be cruel. Good enough to go on is a philosophy that gets caravans home. Religious life travelled as steadily as goods and services, but this first night we see it mostly by lamplight, as a posture rather than a proclamation. In a copying room there is paper smoothed against its board, ink that smells faintly of pine, a brush with a lesson plan. A monk, or a lay scribe with a neat hand, copies a text with attention that has learned how to be kind to itself. Somewhere else, a small fire is fed with clean wood and reverence. Someone bows toward a niche and whispers gratitude that the day kept its temper. In a city's market ward, a chapel door stands open, so that those who prefer silence can borrow some before they bargain again. Under a lamp in a caravanserai cell, a traveller memorises a sentence and tucks it into the mind the way a mother tucks a child in against draught. Hazard exists, but we are not courting it tonight. The wind will have its tantrums. A pass will decide to be dramatic at the wrong hour. A gate will change its fee and pretend not to recall last week's arrangement. Caravans manage risk by choreography. Travel in company. Listen more than you announce. Let paper walk where coin would stumble. Breathe with the season. Bandits appear in stories like Thunder, but in life often resemble cousins of minor chiefs who prefer to collect tolls with a wink. A small payment at a certain rock, a guide whose eyes know where the path chooses honesty over speed, a detour that adds a day and subtracts a quarrel. These are the road's favourite negotiations. Pride is expensive out here. Patience earns interest. If you want to measure how the road worked, listen for Order's sounds. A seal face kisses clay and leaves its tiny portrait. A brush lifts from the character with a small sigh. A register page turns with a thock you feel more than hear. A touchstone whispers when a coin tells the truth. Under many skies, Han or Kushan, Parthian or Sasanian, Gupta, Byzantine, Tang. This music reassured more than edicts could. Flags can boast, receipts keep people warm. During generous centuries, empires laid blankets of order across the ground. Relay stations, predictable tolls, waybills, and caravans grew just ambitious enough to be profitable without attempting to be foolish. In tighter years, the blankets became shawls. Innkeepers and roadmen and guilds kept enough of the routine alive that tomorrow could be persuaded to resemble yesterday. What did a caravan carry besides goods and paperwork? It carried relationships, a letter of introduction that crossed a language before it crossed a city gate. A promise that someone's cousin would be treated like someone's brother. A recipe swapped across a courtyard because the stew was memorable, and pride in this case was less valuable than lunch. It carried arrangements that looked surprisingly modern, profit-sharing ventures between a home partner and a travelling partner, endowments signed with flourishes, which then turned into lamps and porridge for strangers, informal remittances managed by brokers whose trust travelled faster than their messengers. Each of these rested on the same quiet premise: a reputation is the currency that buys rescue on a bad day. We should linger a moment in a family courtyard, because households were the punctuation marks in the long sentence of the road. Afternoon sun filters through lattice. Scales hang from a beam and decide calmly to be accurate. A woman balances the day's accounts with a pencil line that would make a calligrapher approve. A child counts almonds from bowl to bowl, learning what numbers feel like when they have responsibilities. In a chest, bolts of cloth stand upright like well-behaved soldiers, stamped with the workshop mark that says both pride and liability. Letters are read aloud while bread cools. News comes folded into tenderness. The eastern pass is moody. The northern market smells like apricots. The older uncle's knees are worse, but his jokes have improved. Lantern oil is measured out for evening. The door's hinge gets a drop of kindness, so its click will be friendly at dusk. Households caught the road when it stumbled and sent it back out again, better tied and better fed. Consider too the discretion with which the sea approached the same work, but we will save most of that for our final part. For now, it is enough to say that monsoon winds wrote schedules on air. Ports answered with warehouses and courtyards shaped for shade. And paper again held value like a magician with nothing up his sleeves. The land and the sea were not competitors but colleagues. When one sulked, the other invited travellers in for tea. Back in our courtyard inn, the lamps are trimmed, and the wick has learned moderation. Animals shift and settle. A dog decides to take its duties seriously from a comfortable position. Farriers sort tools by touch. A scribe knees under a low table, writes a date that will be a clue to someone long after we have all gone to bed. The gatekeeper closes the gate with the certainty of a person who has found the exact argument a door wants to hear. There is a small, important click. It says, the inside will remain the inside until morning. Before we sleep, it helps to remember scale. No single dynasty owned the road, though many tried to pay its rent. No single religion sang the only lullaby, though many hymns learned to harmonise. No signature can be called the first, no seal the last. What held the web together was persistence in ordinary things, the mulberry leaves that needed clipping at the hour they preferred, the strap that required an unhurried stitch, the kettle set on coals at the same time each evening, the ledger that closed with 2 lines drawn under the numbers so they would stay where they were put. If the Silk Road has a secret, it is that its greatest luxury was never jewels or spices. It was the dependable day. You set down your modern phone. The tracking bar is still inching. It will inch without you. In the courtyard of our story, the lantern has reduced itself to a halo meant for rest, and the kettle, having contributed the evening's peaceful steam, has taken up the quiet work of cooling. Somewhere a camel dreams of a shrub with better manners, and a scribe places a small stone atop a stack of papers so the night will keep its promises. The old tracking number breathes, steady. Hoof bell breath. We follow it towards sleep, and in the morning the road will be where we left it. Organised enough to be kind, flexible enough to be true, waiting with her cup and a page and a way forward. The courtyard we left at the end of part 1 is quieter now. Coals burrow into their own warmth. Somewhere in the next cell a page is weighed down with a small stone so the night will not shuffle it out of order. You hear the bell strap on a camel settle like a sleepy bracelet. The road has done its work of carrying. Now the meanings it has carried take their turn. Begin in a room made sturdy against wind, where the air is steady and the table legs know their job. A lamp burns with that neat tailored flame you get when the wick has been trimmed by someone born with patience. Paper lies beneath a brush. The paper isn't a miracle, just the sort of good paper that lets a hand be clear. A monk or a lay scribe with tidy ambitions copies a sutra. He breathes the way you hope for when the mind is trying to be kind to itself. Slow, even, with a pause at the end of the line that feels like a small bow. Outside, a courtyard gathers starlight as if it were water. Inside, a verb chooses its future. Buddhism walked the oases in sandals and careful adjectives, setting up not barricades but habits. In cities around the Tarim Basin, Kusha, Khotan, Kashgar, Turfan, monasteries became what travellers trusted. Consistent kitchens, rooms where windows learn not to rattle, libraries that smell faintly of pine soot and effort. A monk blessed a journey at dawn. The same monk thanked the cook at dusk with a sentence that had learned to take its shoes off at the door. The faith moved along the same arcs as cloth and tea, polite to markets and useful to merchants. It met a Chinese love of order, and, in translation halls from the 4th century onward, traded favours with language. Teams debated whether to tuck Sanskrit under familiar Chinese terms or teach readers to adopt newcomers. A single word could hold an evening. Meditative absorption might wear the old phrase quiet thought, or it might keep its exotic syllables and become a name of its own, the seed of Chan and later Zen. The lamp, indifferent to fame, simply became refilled. Art took up the conversation with its usual speed. In Gandhara, under Kushan skies, sculptors gave drapery the memory of Mediterranean breezes. A stone Buddha stood with a weight shifter learned from a far-off shore and somehow looked local anyway. Farther east, dry caves remembered everything. At Kizil, and later at Magao near Dunhuang, pigments climbed walls and settled into centuries. Lapis blues that seem to breathe, malachite greens that consider the viewer with courteous calm, reds that know the difference between signal and shout. Donors kneel in corners in coats, embroidered with the patient arrogance of thread. Attendants hold lotus stems with the naturalness of people who have held many other things all day. Borders teem with the small parables, a prince learning generosity, a ship with sails that know monsoon logic, a stupor throwing bells into the wind and asking it to behave. Pilgrims wrote the road into the literature of logistics, Faxian in the early 5th century, Xuanzang in the 7th, Yijing not long after. All of them left careful notes that read like weather reports for wisdom. The pass is passable. The monastery at such and such keeps good discipline and better rice. The library there copies in a hand you can trust. They tuck doctrinal clarity beside advice about winter cloaks and which innkeeper likes to talk before counting, and that they were right to give both space. Ideas travel best when someone has already boiled the water. Near those same roots, Zoroastrian communities kept aflame with the sort of steadiness workshops admire. The fire temple's ash was tidy, the altar's stone felt like an argument for equilibrium. Traders bowed, offered clean wood, and carried onward the learned habit of reverence for what burns without boasting. Funerary practice, handled with respect, adapted to the towns where families lived. Ossuary grounds could look like little neighbourhoods, houses for memory set in order, each with a lid that would feel right under a palm. In murals at Panjakent, heroes feasted and fought, but your eye keeps returning to bin table linens, fruit in bowls, bracelets that caught light, evidence that ordinary grace is the best way inside a stewie. Zoroastrians in Chinese cities held offices meant for foreign merchants and organised caravans with the same reliability they'd brought to fire tending. Commerce likes this kind of piety, punctilious, undramatic, forgiving, of long hours. Manichaeans came with the painter's confidence, Mani's 3rd century vision, an ambitious weave of earlier teachings into a cosmology of light and dark, made books that travelled in multiple tongues and images that gave faces to ideas across borders. In Uyghur courts for a while, the temples were white plastered and clear lined, their banners tuned to a light that didn't need persuasion to look divine. Politics, as ever, changed its mind. Communities learned to be quiet and mobile. Even so, fragments slept in caves and storerooms, parchment that outlived quarrel by trusting dryness better than argument. On the road, Manichaeism often looked like a polite guest who knows how to help wash up after supper. The Church of the East stepped into Chinese annals in 635 when an envoy named Alepen arrived to meet a Tang emperor with a portfolio of translation and a gift for tone. A stele carved in 781 still tells the tale in Chinese characters with Syriac flourishes, a text that reads like a handshake. The terminology bent toward Chinese habits, a single creator beyond form, ordered prayer, a tidy monastic housekeeping that puts sweeping into a theological frame, very convincing to anyone who's ever seen what dust can do when unsupervised. Communities never grew large, but they learned cities well, running clinics, studying the skies, translating enough to survive the century's moods. Their courage was domestic rather than theatrical, the bravery of lamps that keep steady when the festival outside grows noisy. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Islam moved along the same arteries, first as rumour and travellers' manners, then as law and endowment. In the oases and cities of Transoxiana, the call to prayer arrived not as a shout but as punctuality. Market life liked the clarity of contracts set in a reliable frame and the stability of coinage that didn't change its mind between stalls. Courts weighed disputes by texts, not tempers. Endowments, waybif deeds, written in careful hands, turned water fountains, schools and travellers' lodgings into institutions that kept doing their duties beyond the lifespan of any donor. Sufi teachers, with their portable rooms made of listening, threaded households together, remembrance spilled over into courtesy. Conversion in these regions was usually incremental. Some households moved quickly into the new frame, others kept older practices in a pocket for a while before setting them down gently, where they would be kept with fondness. The road prefers additions to erasures. In the courtyard economies where all of these traditions met, doctrinal debates took their turn at the table and then yielded to housekeeping. A caravanserai's prayer niche pointed to Mecca for some, a meditation room waited with a cushion for others, a shelf held a little lamp and a dish of fruit for anyone whose thanks liked props. One person whispered a verse before tying the lead rope. Another offered a pinch of flour to the kitchen shrine. A third pledged a portion of profit to the traveller's rest house because generosity keeps bridges mended. Pluralism, to use our word, often looked like neighbours who had learned each other's schedules. The spice seller who covered the cinnamon just before the call began, the muezzin who knew which bakery's loaves would come out precisely as the courtyard emptied, and everyone wanted something simple and warm. All of this had to sit somewhere, and that somewhere was the household. The road without households is a sentence without punctuation. Energetic but exhausting. In a merchant quarter of Samarkand or Bukhara, Kashgar or Changan, you could stand at a threshold and watch the economy learn its manners. Scales hung from a beam with the air of instruments that tune themselves. A woman balanced ledgers that would make an auditor smile and a poet jealous. Children practiced numbers by moving almonds from bowl to bowl, serious as priests. A bolt of cloth stood upright in a chest like a gentleman attending a concert. Label stitched, origin remembered, accountability intact. Letters arrived and were read aloud, gossip and accounting in the same breath, because affection and prudence have always shared a vocabulary. Women ran shops outright when partners were on the road, or when it turned out, as it often does, that they were better at it. A money changer's wife tapped the touchstone with the confidence of someone who has seen base metal try to pass for noble, and knows flattery when it chimes. A weaver's daughter closed the day with a column so straight it could have been used to align a doorway. A widow inherited a caravan share and chose to invest in dye stuffs because colour, unlike gossip, can be fixed. Endowment ledgers preserve women's names in the lines no one scraped away. Lamps for winter evenings. A water trough outside the gate. A stipend for travellers who arrive between markets with more intentions than coin, public housekeeping written in ink. Crafts met hazard with competence disguised as modesty. Rope makers walked backward the length of courtyards, twisting fibre into lines that forgave mistakes and punished laziness, humming the same tune their grandmothers hummed. Blacksmiths annealed and tempered with a patience you can hear in the tap-tap-tap that travels across a neighbourhood like a rumour of diligence. Potters threw jars that travelled without sulking and returned to storage without surprise. Dyers scolded blues into depth and coaxed reds out of their usual desire to get ahead of themselves. Saddle makers unlearned mistakes while animals watched with that calm alien interest that keeps humans improving. Repair was an ethic as much as a trade. Straps stretched, straps were restitched, hinges complained, hinges were given oil and a sympathetic word. Good enough to go on was not defeat. It was a philosophy tuned to survival. Credit is what let courage travel farther than calves alone could manage. Not everywhere, not always, but often enough to matter. Value moved on paper or on split sticks rather than on silver that invited envy. A letter of payment folded into a sleeve could hopscotch from city to city. Its trust carried by partners who had made a habit of paying on the nail and baking decent biscuits. Informal remittance networks, organised kindness really, allowed a husband to leave value with a broker in one town while the broker's cousin distributed coin to a family 2 deserts away. Such mechanisms wore many names over centuries, but the principle was simple and tender. Smooth the distance so households do not have to sell the copper pot to keep the baker friendly. Money changers kept order at human scale. The little brass weights in their velvet-lined boxes looked like a family of mushrooms taking a nap. Each was gild-stamped and old enough to have developed opinions. The touchstone streak read a coin's honesty better than a lecture. Scales learned to be accurate because inspectors tapped them with sticks in public, and the silence that followed meant more than any sermon. Counterfeiters existed, of course, but so did noses that could smell trouble in metal the way a shepherd smells weather. Reputation, the road's favourite currency, brought rescue on bad days and discount on good ones. Risk, the companion with good manners, walked alongside all of this. Sandstorms asked for quiet rather than courage. Cloth across mouth and nose, animals turned to present less fuss to the wind, a kettle put on in a lee of saddles, a story told about an even worse storm where someone remembered not to tie the lead rope to his own belt. Snow demanded dawn starts and early halts. Avalanches prefer we not discuss them at bedtime, but they are the reason caravans consult the cold before they pretend to be brave. Heat turned shade into architecture and patience into policy. Rivers insisted on angling upstream and learning the trick that lets water do some of the work. Bridges taught trust. The best were humble piles of stone and timber that minded their own business and lasted longer than poems. People could be hazard, but people also solved it. Local chiefs levied tolls with as much ceremony as a tax collector and sometimes more courtesy. A donation at a certain rock bought an escort and genuine safety beyond. Bandits, when not a fiction, often turned out to be cousins with seasonal cash flow issues. Conversation and the right coin solved what courage would only complicate. Politics had weather systems of its own. A new governor altered the mood at a gate. Toll doubled with an apologetic cough. The answer was paperwork. Receipts hung from cords like obedient tassels. Seals kissed clay. Signatures grew graceful. Tallies split and rejoined with the same satisfying click that doors make when a house is well built. A caravan's archive lived in a saddlebag and could be consulted by moonlight if need pressed its case. Illness, which travels faster than a mule when it is in the mood, received the same choreography as any storm. Bowls and cups were rinsed with attention. Hands remembered what water and soap can do. Greetings leaned toward the eyes rather than fingers. A twist of ginger, a pinch of mint, a resin lozenge for a throat trying to turn itself into an instrument. Small remedies were tucked into pouches with the seriousness one gives to matches. Vinegar worked behind the scenes like a typist with a gift for exactness. Boiled water remained the closest thing the human world has to a portable guarantee. Pride took a back seat to rest when fever refused compliments. Recovery is logistics. Disputes, inevitable as sunset, found referees. The market inspector walked with a stick that was part baton, part ruler. He tapped once on a suspect scale pan and let the silence announce the verdict. In court, a judge listened to two merchants tell the story of a damp bale, as if they were improvising a duet. Witnesses remembered details with that fondness that people have for accuracy when it flatters them. Documents emerged from sleeves with the bashful air that only important paper can carry. The judge decided for tomorrow's calm rather than yesterday's triumph. The losing party bowed in a way that saved his face for and from himself. No one cheered. Cheering in court is a way of inviting drama to move in. Ritual kept nerves from inventing trouble. A driver brushed the led camel's neck and murmured a line of prayer. Not as insurance, though who would refuse it, but as housekeeping for the heart. A trader feeding a shrine's flame remembered that meticulousness is a transferable skill. A householder tied a ribbon to a branch before a pass as a way of telling fear to sit in the corner and play quietly with string. A merchant pledged alms from profit and discovered the oldest hedge against misfortune is generosity, which rarely punishes its investors and often trains friends to watch for each other's carts when backs are turned. Sea routes, which will occupy us more richly next time, already cast their reflections into inland courtyards. A sailor back from Calicut told a ropemaker in Bukhara about a knot that gives in the right direction. A pilgrim returned from Sri Lanka with a way to brew tea that makes mornings reasonable. A merchant from Hormuz married into a family in Kashgar and taught the children to smell cardamom before counting it. Ports and oases learned each other's seasons almost by accident. Monsoon schedules entered household calendars. Caravan timetables adjusted to harbour news. The web did what webs do. It vibrated gently when anything interesting touched it. The day in our imagined city leans toward evening again. A market wind has taught dust to behave. In a doorway, a rug is shaken with that moral seriousness households bring to lint. On a bench, a farrier tells a story about a horse clever enough to pick its own route around potholes, and the metal he shapes takes on the rhythm of the telling. Two cousins compare the northern and southern rims of the desert like academics who enjoy being almost right, and a boy listens hard, ears turned into little notebooks. In the bathhouse, steam unwinds the day's knots. In the mosque, lamps answer dusk with the exact number of flames as yesterday. In a small shrine, a cup of flowers is replenished by a hand that does not seek praise. In a monastery kitchen, the lentils are declared ready by someone with more authority than many kings. Safety is practiced out loud. By now, our road has learned a trick that serves sleep as well as trade. It turns risk down from trumpet to harp. The choreography looks simple when performed well. Travel in company, listen, use paper when possible and coin when necessary. Count the animals early in the day and gratitude late. Sharpen the awl in the argument, but use neither if a cup of tea will do. Share a bench, share a proverb. Share the little joke that camels, given a minute, will certainly try to eat a page of your account book, for they believe themselves literary. We have spoken of faith, but we could just as well call it regularity. A fire that burns without boasting. A prayer that keeps the day's spine straight. A copied page that adds clarity to a shelf. A call that divides the market's noise into rooms. A lullaby that remembers an older hymn. The road made space for fervour, but it survived on steadiness. The belief most widely shared was that careful people should have a fair chance at a decent outcome. That belief built benches and doors and rules and inns, and when belief failed, as it will, those same benches and doors were what let people sit, close the latch and think again. Return briefly to the writing room where we began. The brush is rinsed and shaken. Tiny freckles of ink dry on the mat. The copied page, now joined to its fellows, learns how to lie flat without sticking. The scribe rubs the muscle between thumb and palm, a gesture every worker knows, and places the small stone back on the stack with the satisfaction of a baker counting loaves. In a lane outside, the inspector on his evening walk taps a scale pan once and smiles because it answers like an honest instrument, and he can go home without a story. In a kitchen, someone lays a cloth over the bread so it will cool without turning shy. In a shop, a woman closes her ledger and draws 2 lines beneath the number that means enough for today. The lantern in our caravanserai cell is trimmed again, as lamps enjoy being. The ledger is closed, as ledgers prefer to end their evenings. The kettle sighs and slows its thinking. Faiths rest in their rooms like travellers in a fair inn. Not huddled, not competing, just asleep with their bags in order. Households, the punctuation of movement, hold their breath and then release it, as if to say, "We have caught the day and set it down gently." Outside, the watchman leans on the parapet and empties his pockets of all ambition except attentiveness. Stars repeat themselves, as is their job. Somewhere below, a child turns in his sleep and produces the exact noise a young goat would make if it were dreaming of being praised. "We will meet the sea tomorrow," the other heartbeat of these roots, and the blankets of order that let letters outrun rumour. For now, let the courtyard hold you. The hinge sighs with oil, the door finds its favourite click, the world narrows to the friendly radius of a lamp. On the table, the page waits under its small stone, the ink writes its own dream in the air, and the night agrees for once to mind its manners. Lantern, ledger, kettle, the road's three quiet promises, keeping the same good hours in every house where travellers learn how to rest. Morning leans into the courtyard we left last night. The well ropes are cool to the touch. The gate has that satisfied look doors get when they slept in the position they prefer. Someone places the ledger on the low table, and for a moment the world is nothing but a line, a number, and the small approving thock of a page turned. The road is awake again, not with trumpet flourishes, but with the household music of intention. If part 2 was the evening of meanings and the night of steady lamps, this is the day of arrangements. The blankets of order laid over rough ground, the sea's wind-kept calendar, and the ways those two together stitched distance into routine. Empires tried often to own the roots, the wise ones learned instead to keep them tidy. The word for this in many centuries was simply order, though historians have taught us to hear pax in it, the soft consent by which a stamped slip opens a gate and a courier expects the next relay to have tea already thinking about water. Under the Han, in China's long ago, that meant outposts set like beads along a cord, granaries where mathematics behaved, patrols that preferred boredom to glory, and a protectorate over the western regions that aimed to make a wide, windy vocabulary pronounceable. The man at a desk near the Jade Gate could bind wooden slips, pinch a clay seal, and translate chaos into a permission that fit into a sleeve. That permission, half logistics, half lullaby, made its way across deserts in the company of bales and patience. Westward, other hands smoothed the quilt. The Parthians, and later the Sasanians, held the middle corridors with innkeeper intelligence, prices posted, water clean, rumour discreet. Caravans bought space and safety with receipts that would be recognised again 3 cities on, which is a more miraculous technology than any catapult. Coins learned to be persuasive, silver that made a credible line on a touchstone, designs clear enough to be counted by eyes that had already grown tired that day. Between Iran's tablelands and the high grasslands, Sogdian communities did the work that never makes headlines and always makes history. They introduced partners, fixed misunderstandings with informed tea, and wrote letters that managed to combine almond prices with affection for a cousin's new baby in the same paragraph. Commerce is conversation. Conversation is infrastructure. South and east, the Kushan realm made the hinge between the Indo-Gangetic world and the mountains usable. Their coins spoke many scripts, their passes held still long enough to let traders and pilgrims and ideas believe they had not been unwise. A stone Buddha in Gandhara could wear drapery that had learned something from Mediterranean breezes without forgetting where its sandals stood. In India, the Gupta age, long seasons of it, let guilds plan. Roads keep their promises, fairs happen on time, and accountants add with an accuracy that convinced even poets to trust them. West again to the Mediterranean's long apron. Rome put harbours on schedules and granaries into poems of grain. Byzantium kept a sea-girt ledger in the capital and, in a neat act of independence, learned to rear its own silkworms. You can almost hear the court whisper to the moths, "We respect your privacy, please spin at your convenience." When order was in a mood, it arrived not as a parade, but as paperwork that behaved. A waybill stamped at one post earned a nod at the next. A string sealed with lead reported the state of a bale without raising its voice. Market wards in a Tang capital kept hours with library discipline. Gates open, gates shut, all of it rung on a bell that had learned to speak without gossip. In the Abbasid world, contracts drew straight lines between obligation and outcome. Letters of payment let courage travel lighter than silver, and a judge could look at two merchants trying to convince him that a damp bale had been damp on purpose and rule for tomorrow's peace as carefully as for yesterday's facts. Endowments written in hands that took their vows seriously made caravanserais and fountains permanent. Charity put on the uniform of infrastructure and went to work. Across Anatolia later, stone inns rose like dependable thoughts, their portals carved with that modest swagger stone sometimes permits itself. A traveller could count on 3 days' shelter without fee, a curry comb for a tired animal, a bath that persuaded the road's dust to stop being dramatic, and a scribe whose neatness caused people to behave. Under Mongol skies, when the thunder of hooves had settled into administration, the Yam relay system threw a net of stations and remounts over an expanse so large that a letter could outrun rumour and arrive neat. A paisi, those tablets of authority, wore on a cord or tucked in a sleeve could turn a suspicious gate into an eager one, provided the bearer remembered the Empire's preference for tact over triumph. To feel that order in your bones, imagine a clerk sliding a fresh mount's reins into a courier's hand before the previous mount's breath has finished its own sentence. That is what quiet speed sounds like. Order is not free. It costs taxes, signatures, the patience to let a clerk finish the copy before you touch the page. Inspectors develop the talent for sighing at creative packaging. Tolls have moods. Yet the road forgives almost anything if the rules behave the same way tomorrow. There were interruptions, inevitably. A frontier rattled. A rebellion tore a long seam. An emperor in one capital and a caliph in another remembered that edges are invitations. But even when the big blanket folded, shawls remained. An innkeeper still kept a register as if the empire paid him personally. A farrier shod a mule with a calm that did not require a minister's approval. A scribe copied a book because copying is what one does when the weather paces the wall. Habits outlived the wide promises. Listen for the instruments by which order made its music. A brush whispering a character into wet ink. The click of a small seal's face kissing wax. The amicable quarrel of cells finding balance. The efficient bell at a relay. The low gossip of stamps encountered and stamps to come. Under those sounds, caravans relaxed their shoulders by half a hand's breadth and discovered that ambition could stretch one more town without snapping. We might be tempted to call these centuries golden. The road, which dislikes flattery, preferred reliable. Now the sea. It has been waiting at the edge of our courtyards, smelling of rope and intentions, and it would like to speak in wind. The monsoon is the first and last word of this chapter. In winter, northeasterlies push ships from South China and the archipelago toward the Indian coast. In summer, southwesterlies carry them home again. Generations of pilots learned that schedule with the pleasant stubbornness farmers reserve for rain. A nakuda in the Persian Gulf, a helmsman at Calicut, a captain in Quanzhou, each waited for the agreed wind, which is the sea's form of bureaucracy, and sailed when it began to sign documents. Ships looked different, but believed in much the same things: flexibility, patience, timbers that remember what being a tree taught them. In the Western Ocean, dhows wore lateen sails, triangular wings that listened closely, and hulls whose planks in many regions were sewn with fibre, so that wood would move like thoughtfully woven cloth rather than crack like pride. If you've ever chosen flexible clothes for a long day, you already understand naval architecture. In Chinese yards, shipwrights built high-stern junks with multiple masts and watertight bulkheads that turned misfortune into a manageable puddle. Stern-post rudders put authority where the hands could keep it. Instruments were simple, clever, and adequate to the night. An astrolabe to hold the sun, or a star steady long enough to confess latitude. A little board on a string measured knots that let a pilot keep Polaris at a remembered height. A compass that, by songtimes, gave the Chinese mariner private advice when clouds were opinionated. No one mistook any of these for miracle. They were good tools, like a reliable kettle. Navigation was partly literature. Sailing directions, Rahmaniya in one region, practical poetry everywhere, spoke in distances, bearings, and warnings that had learned to be kind. Depart on such a moon. Keep the dark island to starboard until the herons are quarrelsome. Do not argue with the shoal named after a saint. Stars carried names that tasted of Arabic and Persian, Tamil and Chinese, and pilots spoke to them as one speaks to relatives, with respect and the occasional affectionate complaint. At night, the sail hummed, the hull creaked at a tempo that made philosophers feel licensed, and the cook fried something fragrant on a small iron plate, while the pilot squinted at a familiar pattern and said, "There you are. That sentence has delivered more cargo than any fleet." Ports along these routes learned to be comfortable for strangers. On the Gulf, Siraf's terraces climbed toward light. Later, Hormuz clasped the strait like a patient jewel box. Down the Arabian Sea and along India's edge, Sohar and Muscat, the mouths of the Indus, Cambay and Chal, and the long pepper-scented strand of Malabar, Kozhikode among others, met ships with warehouses and wells and the sensible kindness of people who had already done the numbers. The smell in a Malabar morning market made people generous. Pepper drying on mats, coconut oil warming, cardamom proposing an alliance. East through the Strait of Malacca, the door narrowed wisely. Srivijaya for a time remembered with ease the particular toll for each sort of hull, and provided pilots who knew the local habit of shoals that rearranged themselves in a mood. Farther east, Quanzhou and Guangzhou balanced bustle with bureaucracy. Quanzhou could fill a horizon with masts and still find room for one more, like an inn with a knack for discovering an extra bed. Still, inscriptions there preserve names that show how families adopt harbours as if they were relatives who cook well. Religion walked these quays without needing to announce itself. Mosques stood beside warehouses with wells rimmed in stone worn to good manners. In Quanzhou, one structure spoke Arabic in stone and Chinese in courtyard. Elsewhere, shrines to sea-minded deities offered help in languages that had never been strangers, only neighbours. Buddhist monasteries in Southeast Asia learned to chant in Pali and cook in local taste. Hindu temples rang bells in rhythms that synchronized with the harbours. In the Swahili towns, mihrabs cut elegantly into coral stone faced a familiar direction, across a water that never seemed foreign, only obliging. The faiths lived as crews do, each at its station, all of them sailing the same wind, happy to share a kettle. Documents bound the sea to counting houses. Partners wrote agreements that divided daring and money fairly, so that a person with capital and a person with salt in their hair could be friends at distance and not enemies at reunion. Letters of payment, light, foldable confidence moved value along the coasts without rattling pirates into enthusiasm. In one corner of this ocean's paper, letters from Jewish merchants, now famous for having hidden themselves for 1,000 years in a Cairo storeroom, tell us about pepper and cousins, monsoons and small disasters. The handwriting is tidy, the tone is human, and the combination of cinnamon with compliments to an aunt is as persuasive as any actuarial table. Sail down the East African coast and you step into towns where coral turns to architecture and Swahili to poetry. Mombasa, Malindi, Kilwa, Zanzibar. Each an argument that stone remembers, tides and families remember roots. Traders sold ivory and gold from inland, mangrove poles and coconuts from the edge. They took home cotton cloth and glazed bowls whose blues looked like good decisions. Courts wrote with the surgeon's pens, markets ran on courtesy you could set your watch by. And in courtyards one might find an Indian textile dancing on a clothes line, a Yemeni bowl catching light, and a poem recited in a metre that felt like a boat's motion. When the summer monsoon brought dhows gleaming with salt and satisfaction, harbours grinned. In island Southeast Asia, spices guarded their addresses with charming stubbornness. Clove trees in Maluku, nutmeg in the Banda Archipelago. And local sailors stitched the archipelago into habit with prouse and jong that understood wind's moods. Pilots there navigated by stars and stories, the latter as reliable as the former if told by the right uncle. In Chinese waters, ports counted ships with the pride of clerks and the shy happiness of grandparents. Quanzhou's custom house kept ledgers that would have won prizes for neatness if the sea granted awards. Later, in the early 15th century, fleets from a Ming court performed visits so large that even the ocean blinked. Those voyages were ceremony as much as commerce, a reminder that politeness can be scaled. When policy turned inward again, the sea adjusted. Private trade bent like bamboo and continued to grow. In the Red Sea and along the Nile's old corridor, other hands took their turn holding the funnel. Aiden's terraces watched the trickle of spice into warehouses. Jeddah balanced pilgrimage with pepper. Alexandria kept a ledger that looked both ways. Northward, Mediterranean merchants learned when to arrive and what price to pretend to be surprised about. A while later, Europeans found a salt-sprayed route around Africa and introduced new habits to the old hallways, forts with ideas about who should speak first, contracts with accents and cannons. Portuguese flags fluttered on small islands of stone. Dutch ambitions nursed a grudge against anyone else's nutmeg. English patients found profit in textiles and later tea. None of this erased older roots. It rearranged them as new furniture will do to a familiar room. Gujarati brokers still brokered. Hadrami families still tied the Western Rim to the Far East with marriages and letters. Malay pilots kept their star charts in their heads and updated them after storms, which is arguably where the best charts live. Overland routes did not retire when the sea grew confident. They changed employment. Caravans bent toward new capitals that liked carpets, gardens, manuscripts, and meals that took their time. The coffee that travelled by ship learned to enjoy the company of camel and mule. The porcelain that rode oceans found itself baffled but intact on a snowy table in the north. A long northern line woke and called itself, later, the Tea-Road Road. Bales moving from Chinese hills across Gobi and Tiger to Russian markets, where samovars found a new tempo and cups felt an unusual grit of far dust. The road smiled at being reminded of itself. Modernity sped up the sea and rescheduled the land while leaving old wisdom intact. Steam engines dissolved the tyranny of monsoon calendars, though old sailors continued to stare at the sky out of habit because habits outlast engines. A canal cut through desert and stitched blue to blue. Telegraph cables crept along seabeds and taught news to outrun hulls. Rails paralleled caravan routes and then departed to take up residence elsewhere, inviting towns to listen for whistles as they once listened for bells. Containers arrived, square, stubborn, treaty, and turned cargo into a universal grammar. Cranes learned choreography. The sea looked for a moment like a hallway with carpet after all. The phrase we have been obediently calling the Silk Road is a late name for a long practice. It is useful and mischievous. It flatters silk and neglects pepper, paper, people. The best proof the roots existed is in the small things that remained after grand projects changed their minds. Loanwords settled in like relatives who came for a week and never left. Cotton, sugar, orange, and dozens more borrowed comfortably across tongues. Instruments learned new tunings. The oud, travelling west, taught the lute to be domestic with dignity. Rhythms crossed straits disguised as lullabies. A pattern from Jingdezhin landed in a kitchen in Zanzibar, and looked like local coolness, which it had become, a bread stamp in Anatolia, hammered into dough with a pattern that keeps a loaf honest, conversed wordlessly with a stamp pressed into a bale's cord 2 countries away. Good design recognises itself. Museums, where the night guard walks softly and labels pretend to be complete, hold bowls whose glaze remembers a kiln 1,000 miles from where the bowl now lives. A bolt of silk whose selvage mutters to a curator that lime mordant was involved. A child's shoe too small to be tragic, too durable to be unimportant. Archives keep letters that smell faintly of almond and dust. In one, a woman merchant writes to her brother about rates in Surat and the vexed question of the boy's handwriting. In another, a Chinese skipper notes the swell and a rope with a personality. In a third, a jurist in a port far from deserts composes a ruling on a lost cargo of indigo and compliments. In an aside, the reliable honesty of a witness who dislikes sun. These lives did not think themselves history. They thought themselves busy. That is how histories there worth sleeping by are made. Walk now into a present port with the old roots in your ear. Cranes are tall, containers obedient, diesel has replaced tar, and the gulls continue to believe they are underappreciated. In the market behind the docks, however, the past is walking around as if it had paid rent. A sack of cardamom is lifted and appraised, first by the nose and then by the scale. A tea seller pours with a flourish that makes his grandfather's wrist remember itself. A cloth merchant folds 6 yards into a stack that refuses to misbehave. A baker stamps bread with a pattern older than anyone in the room and newer than the loaf. Lamps in a courtyard answer dusk with the correct number of flames. Above a shop, a quiet room for meditation, call it what you like, waits for a traveller who has nothing to confess except tiredness. Languages mingle without permission slips. Jokes cross aisles. A child runs an errand with a seriousness we should all envy. This perhaps is the echo that matters. Not that a particular empire's line went from here to there, or that the sea was conquered by this hull or that, but that people grew practiced at being useful to strangers. The routes did not promise safety. They offered predictability and, when the maid could spare it, kindness. Households distilled that into habits. A hinge oiled for its sound at dusk. A kettle set long before guests arrived. A ledger closed with 2 lines under the last figure. Not because the number needed reinforcement, but because minds do empires on their best days. Learn to fund the same virtues at scale. Bridges that stayed up, inns that stayed open, courts that stayed awake when it mattered, and asleep when it didn't. We have come a long way from the mulberry leaves and the tray of cocoons, but the thread still draws through the hand with that same mild authority. A caravan's bell, a ship's bell, both are timing devices more than alarms. They announce a change of watch, not an emergency. The sea is not better than the land, nor the land better than the sea. Like sensible colleagues they traded shifts. When deserts sulked, harbours smiled. When monsoons muttered, relay posts roused. Evenings remain the same quality of useful. In a city far from where we began, a customs officer stamps a document and hands it back with the professional flourish that distinguishes bureaucracy from chaos. A pilot in a strait looks at the sky and the tide and decides, without announcement, because real choices do not need applause, that tonight is good. A money changer closes his velvet-lined box, waits nesting like mushrooms in sleep. A woman draws 2 lines beneath a figure and ties the ledger with string. A child is taught to trim the lamp. The lamp learns the lesson, which is really a story about attention. The gate of our caravanserai closes again as doors do when a long day has earned its click. The bell on the tether sighs. The kettle sits in its corner and names itself steam again for a few intelligent minutes. The ledger receives its stone and practices being heavy. We have walked from blankets of order to winds with personalities and back to rooms where routines make sleep reasonable. If there is a single luxury the roots delivered and still deliver, it is this. The dependable day, not an untroubled one, no such thing, but a day whose troubles can be met with practiced gestures that do not humiliate hope. So we end as we have ended before, with the 3 small promises that have followed us from courtyard to quay and back, the lantern trimmed, the ledger closed, the kettle breathing out. A bell marks an hour without raising its voice. The watchman hums a tune that would get along with any lullaby. Somewhere, an animal dreams of greener thorns and a pilot dreams of a star at the right height. We set the page beneath its friendly stone, let the ink write its pale scent in the air, and allow the night once again to mind its manners. And so, our journey for tonight comes to a quiet close. The story lingers, like the last glow of candlelight, as you drift further into rest. If these gentle wanderings bring you peace, I invite you to like and subscribe so that whenever you wish, you may return and we can travel together once more. For now, dear listener, may your dreams be kind and your night be restful. Until next time.